right, folks. So as you can tell, I'm gonna try to do just a marathon of videos for you so that you have access to all of the material from before we started doing videos. This is gonna be some evolution videos. Um, yeah. Talking about microevolution, and then we talk about macroevolution. History of evolution, Charles Darwin, Finches, Galapagos Islands. You know this. You know this. All of this. Um, Basically, he observed that organisms either survive or don't survive. If they survive, they pass on their genetics. If they don't, they die off, and those genetics don't get passed on. So basically, we see all these different adaptations, all these varieties of things. If it increases my fitness, it will be selected and I will reproduce. If it's not, it gets chopped out. This is why we see certain traits like big ears in the desert start to become prevalent because big ears allow for evaporative cooling, means I'm more successful. Because the earth is not static, it changes, therefore species are constantly changing. The example of the peppered moth, we see fluctuations between like 90% being black, 90% then to 90% being like the speckled color because the environment changed. This is called industrial melanism. Basically, soot caused pollution and made it look dark, and so they had to adapt to look dark to avoid being eaten. How do we define evolution? Evolution is defined as the change in inherited characteristics over successive generations. Micro is going to be like the DNA and the alleles. Macro is looking at a community or a population as a whole. Again, microevolution, change in gene frequency. We know that we have DNA. DNA has certain genes that code for certain proteins, and those proteins show up in our phenotype. Macroevolution is the evolution looking past the individual, so looking at the group, looking at like new species that are formed or a whole group of organisms that changes. Terms you should know: species, right? They can mate and produce viable offspring. Gene pool is if I looked at all of the organisms in my species, in my population, and all of the genes that they have together. That's my gene pool. Allelic frequency is the percent of an allele in that gene pool. How does variation arise? Mutations, gene duplication, chromosome fusion. When we think about meiosis, all of those things can lead to genetic variation. Most mutations are bad and recessive, so they don't show up. But there's a couple that will show up and they will allow for exceeding fitness. Different types of mutations. Point mutations occur when one nucleotide is substituted for another. So that means one codon is changed because a codon makes one nucleotide. So this, a lot of the time, those three codons might change in one letter, will still make the same nucleotide. So it is like not a negative or silent. It's a silent mutation, is what we call it, or synonymous. It makes the same nucleotide. Non-synonymous or missense means that either I make a new nucleotide. That's a problem. I make a new nucleotide and it functions the same as the original one, or I make one and it functions better. Neutral mutations, we talked about this, right? That sometimes mutations will not cause any change, and it's fine. We just see that it increases diversity. These are all examples of that, which don't worry about so much. Frameshift mutation changes how I read the codons. They are almost all negative because it shifts the whole rest of how I read the DNA. It's very rare that this could be a beneficial change. Other things that we could see: chromosome rearrangement, inversions, deletions, duplications, translocations, and fusions. These could all happen during crossing over during meiosis. Sometimes they are beneficial, sometimes they are not good. if I end up with excessive stuff like that. There's also man-made changes. We see this here that we have selected for certain desirable traits. One species, wild mustard, it's a brassica. We end up with kale, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi, all from the same plant because we chose for specific traits. We call it artificial selection. This is examples talking about antibiotics and artificial selection, MRSA and staph infections again. We see mutations. We see mutations in viruses because we make a treatment for one virus and it will mutate. Reducing or eliminating variability. This can happen in a variety of ways. If we kill off a large group of the organisms for whatever reason, we lose a lot of the variability. Luckily, sexual reproduction is going to increase my variability as opposed to asexual reproduction because I'm combining two organisms' DNA. I'm also going to switch slides really quick. Here we go, to talk more about microevolution. Okay. Again, talk about evolution, what it is. Allele frequencies, right? If I look at these frogs, this would be my population, and all of its alleles are in the gene pool. Then I want to know how many, right? I have CG is green, CR is blue, and CR is red. And it says blue, but they're actually purple in the slides. I want to know the allele frequency of CG versus CR because it's a single allele. If I wanted to know phenotype frequencies, I would do frequency of green, blue, and red. And I can do a really simple percentage calculation shown here. Again, shown here. If you want to look into how to do allele frequencies, pause this. So when we're talking about different factors that can influence the allelic frequencies, we see genetic drift sometimes. Small populations can experience allelic frequency changes more dramatically. If I only have 3 individuals, a single change in allelic frequencies is going to impact that species in a very large way. And so we see an issue. Genetic drift or allelic drift is the change in the frequency of a gene in a population due to random sampling in the absence of a selective pressure. Basically, what this is saying is that when a population is dramatically reduced, genes are lost and negative mutations are also increased. This is most commonly seen, genetic drift is most commonly seen, the loss of a large amount of genetics is most commonly seen in the bottleneck effect, where there's basically a cutting off of a large population, and then the organisms lose most of their genetic diversity. These are some examples of the bottleneck effect. The founder effect is the loss of genetic variation. So I have a bottleneck event occur, making my population very small. Genetic drift means that I've lost a lot of variability. And then the founder effect is the idea that basically like the founders of the new population are going to create a totally different gene pool. And so that's what we see. The founder effect is also very common on islands because it isolates just a set group and then they breed and become this new species. Example in lizards, examples in Amish communities, anything that is like pretty isolated. Impact of non-random mating. When there is non-random mating, we see that like the concentration of alleles is going to be increased. Sexual selection is also going to impact what my gene pool looks like, right? If I'm choosing a certain phenotype that I want to mate with, I'm also choosing certain genes that I want to mate with. This means that the next organisms are going to look a certain way. Think about like dog breeding. I choose for certain organisms, and eventually my whole species is going to look more like the organisms I have selected. Hardy-Weinberg problems, look these up. I'm not going to talk about it right now. If you need to look at it. Natural selection. This is the one thing that like changes or like fuels evolution. Natural selection is basically the sorting of what's going to work and what's not. Organisms that are naturally selected will survive, those that are not will die off. And it all has to do with relative fitness. How likely am I to survive in comparison to my other counterparts? We see three types of selection: directional, moving in one direction; disruptive, stabilizing. We've already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into it again. If you need explanations on this, please ask. Sexual selection, we've talked about this again. I choose a mate based on look as well as other traits, and so that means that I will pass on those other traits. So we also see that there's like intrasexual, which is within the same sex. So mates will, or males mostly, will fight with each other to become dominant and pass on its own traits. Inter would be like choosing a mate to reproduce with. Mate choice. There's a variety of ways that we can preserve genetic variation, and it is important because it allows our species to become more capable of surviving. And these are a couple ways that we make sure that we maintain that. So diploidy in eukaryotes, each organism has 2 copies of every gene, one from mother, one from father, and so even though they code for the same proteins, they contain different genetics. And so diploidy, right, whenever we look at, I have 23 pairs of chromosome, 46 chromosomes total. Diploidy is that double chromosome at each. I also get the dominant and the recessive genes and stuff like that. Balancing selection, basically, balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains 2 or more forms in a population, basically mating and like dying off for other reasons. We also see that the heterozygotes have the advantage. Extremes in genetics are usually going to die off, and so when I'm a heterozygote, I have the most diverse alleles. Therefore, I survive the most and pass them on, which is a good thing. Frequency-dependent selection. This has to do with like the size of the population as well, and how many other organisms there are like me. You can pause this and read it if you want. Also, another example of maintaining diversity is polymorphism. So 2 reasons why evolution, why we can't make like perfect organisms. It can only exist based on the phenotypes that are already there and the environment that is current. We don't know what's coming up next. And evolution is limited by like historical constraints. So I can only receive traits that were already present. Adaptations are often like compromises. So, right, a loud frog cannot be too loud. It can attract a mate, but it'll also attract predators. And we've got chance, natural selection, and environment working together. I'm going to pause here. There's a couple more slides on evolution. We'll do those now.